Change has become a constant. Managing it has become an expanding discipline. The way we embrace it defines our future.
Queen Elizabeth II, the cornerstone of modern British history. Reigning monarch for over 6 decades, she has seen the world change drastically during her time as queen.
My whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
When I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
Her inscrutable commitment to duty has defined her lifetime of service to the throne, her lifetime of service to God. But Elizabeth was never meant to be queen. Join us as we look back at the incredible and incomparable life of Queen Elizabeth II.
I would like above all to declare my resolve to continue, with the support of my family, to serve the people of this great nation of ours to the best of my ability through the changing times ahead. May God bless you all. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, when I attended the commemoration of the 60th anniversary of the D-Day landings, some thought it might be the last such event. But the wartime generation, my generation, is resilient, and I'm delighted to be with you in Portsmouth today. 75 years ago, hundreds of thousands of young soldiers, sailors, and airmen left these shores in the cause of freedom. In a broadcast to the nation at that time, my father, King George VI, said, "What is demanded from us all is something more than courage and endurance. We need a revival of spirit, a new unconquerable resolve." That is exactly what those brave men brought to the battle, as the fate of the world depended on their success. Many of them would never return, and the heroism, courage, and sacrifice of those who lost their lives will never be forgotten. It is with humility and pleasure, on behalf of the entire country, indeed the whole free world, that I say to you all, thank you.
I think the characteristics that spring to mind to me are that she is stable, she's diligent, and she has an extraordinary ability to put duty before everything. And that is, a characteristic that really doesn't exist anymore. But the Queen was probably the last person, to decide that duty was everything. Duty became before personal happiness. Duty became before family and children. And that is the characteristic that defines her. I think the day-to-day life of the monarch is very regimented. I mean, she would be woken that's about 7:30. She would have, her dresser would come in with a cup of tea and some biscuits for the dogs. You know, her clothes would be laid out. She would dress, have breakfast, and then read the newspapers and listen to the radio, and then her day would start, and her private secretary would bring her important letters to look at and sign. And then every 20 minutes during the day, there is an appointment. So it's the same every day during the working week. So it is a very regimented life. The Queen does choose her own wardrobe with her various couturiers, and in the early days it was Norman Hartnell. The Queen is actually quite interested in clothes, and having had so many fittings during her lifetime, she knows exactly how things should be, and she can spot if a hem is a little uneven. You know, she's got a very, very astute eye, and she always says, "I have to be seen." And so that's why she wears such bright colours. And luckily for her, she's got a perfect skin. Even in old age, she has the most beautiful skin, so she can wear the most extraordinarily bright colours. The Queen has two birthdays because King George VI decided that as his birthday was in the winter, it wouldn't do to have ceremonial in the middle of the winter when it was bound to be really cold and pouring with rain. So he made a date in June, and it's always been stuck to as the official birthday, which was the first Saturday in June, and it's celebrated by Trooping the Colour. But the Queen's birthday is actually the 21st of April, so she has two birthdays. Well, the Queen actually does have a very well-developed sense of humour, and she's very funny and very, very quick. But you don't often see it in public. But one example was, of course, the 2012 Olympics, when she met James Bond in Buckingham Palace. And nobody thought, when Danny Boyle, the producer of the opening ceremony, approached the Queen, that she would ever agree. But apparently, she said she would do it as long as she could utter the immortal words, "Good evening, Mr. Bond." She said, "After all, he's come to rescue me."
Good evening, Mr. Bond.
Good evening, Your Majesty.
And then, of course, a double came out wearing the same frock, jumped out of the helicopter into the Olympic Stadium.
Gasp all the way around the stadium.
The fact that she looks very somber, but then, you know, her face can crack into the most wonderful smile, and we learn over the years about her sense of humour and her ability with mimicry. So we've got to know her, but very gradually. The Queen and Sir David Attenborough are almost the same age. I think David Attenborough is 3 weeks older. And there was a wonderful TV documentary in which he sort of chatted with the Queen. He didn't really interview her. And she was showing him around Buckingham Palace Gardens, some of the amazing old trees and plants and things that they have there. And they found, she showed him a sundial, and then she realized it wasn't in the sun. She said, oh, we better move that quickly. And so that they really bounced off well against each other.
I was going to say, a sundial neatly planted in the shade.
Isn't it good? Yes. Had we thought of that? That it was planted in the shade? It wasn't in the shade originally, I'm sure. But maybe we could move it.
In 1926 Britain was a much different place, almost unrecognizable in fact. King George V was on the throne, and Britain was still recovering from the horrors of the Great War, World War I. On April 21st, 1926, the future queen was born, Elizabeth Alexandra Mary.
Princess Elizabeth had a very, very happy childhood. She was born in 1926 in the centre of London, in Bruton Street, and it was 6 weeks before the general strike, so it was a time of great political turbulence. But there was still great excitement about this new royal baby. People were really interested in the royal family, although they never thought that she would be heir to the throne, because at the time everyone loved the Prince of Wales, who of course was later the Duke of Windsor, who abdicated, but all eyes were on him. But this was a beautiful baby, and she was brought up by a series of nannies and nursemaids, and she had very loving parents, and they basically, in those days, people followed the sporting calendar. The winters were in hunting country, summers were in Scotland, and the season was in London. And Elizabeth had this idyllic childhood with her parents and horses and dogs, and also her loving grandparents. Princess Elizabeth has always loved animals. She was given a pony for her 4th birthday, but way before that, she loved her grandfather, King George V's parrot, Charlotte, who used to walk up and down the dining room table. But she was allowed to give Charlotte sugar lumps. And he also had some dogs that she loved. And her mother and father had dogs, so she's always been around animals, but horses became her favorite. Well, the Queen has always loved the Pembrokeshire Corgis, and she first had one as a child. She even took one of her Corgis on her honeymoon, a Corgi called Susan, from which the whole sort of tribe of Corgis are descended from Susan. And they used to, there's lots of little anecdotes that go with the Queen's Corgis, like Prince Philip used to say, it's her dog mechanism. So if there was something awkward in a conversation, she would suddenly say, ooh, and call one of the dogs in order to avoid an awkward question or an awkward answer. And also, the palace staff got used to knowing when the Queen was coming into a room, because there'd be the clatter of, loads of claws. And I think at one time she had 7 Corgis. Now she only has 2, and they are called Dorgies because they're a cross between a Dachshund and a Pembrokeshire Corgi. And she decided she wouldn't have any more puppies because, she felt that, she was too old to really, have puppies around. Not that she'd have to look after them, but she didn't think it was very fair. And she is brilliant with dogs, absolutely brilliant. And she feeds them all herself, in strict order of precedence, but of course there's only 2 left now.
Elizabeth and Philip were first introduced to one another when Elizabeth was just 8 years old. According to eyewitnesses, it was at the wedding of Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, Philip's cousin, and Prince George, Duke of Kent, Elizabeth's uncle, in 1934. It wasn't until 5 years later, when Elizabeth was 13 and Philip was 18, that the two met again at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. This time, Elizabeth fell in love with the man who would become her future husband.
Princess Elizabeth met Prince Philip at a family wedding, but she can't really remember that moment. The reason we know so much about it is because her governess, Marion Crawford, talks in great detail about their first meeting at Dartmouth College, where Prince Philip was a naval cadet. And he was very, very good looking, 18 years old, very striking, blonde looking. And he was assigned to look after the two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, for the day, for their visit, while their parents went around the college. I mean, it was quite strange to think of an 18-year-old looking after princesses, the eldest of whom was 13. But he decided that it would be fun if they jumped the tennis nets. So he took the princesses outside and he jumped the tennis nets for them, and they were very, very impressed. Later, he went on board the vessel that the King and Queen had come to Dartmouth in, and he had lunch, and then the following day he went and had tea. So that was the meeting that the princess remembers.
Elizabeth was just 21 when their engagement was announced on July 9, 1947. The engagement was not without controversy. Philip had no financial standing, was foreign-born, and had sisters who had married German noblemen with Nazi links. Before the marriage, Philip renounced his Greek and Danish titles, officially converted from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism, and adopted the style Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, taking the surname of his mother's British family. Just before the wedding, he was created Duke of Edinburgh and granted the style His Royal Highness. Elizabeth and Philip were married on 20 November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. They received 2,500 wedding gifts from around the world. Because Britain had not yet completely recovered from the devastation of the war, Elizabeth required ration coupons to buy the material for her gown, which was designed by Norman Hartnell. In post-war Britain, it was not acceptable for Philip's German relations, including his 3 surviving sisters, to be invited to the wedding.
Well, from Prince Philip's perspective, this is someone that had to leave their country. They didn't have a home of their own. All his sisters were married to German aristocracy and lived in enormous castles, and there's Philip, living off the goodwill of his relations. So I think that the idea of marrying a princess that was going to inherit so much must have been very attractive. And he was pushed by his uncle, Louis Mountbatten, who was the great kingmaker. And he really pushed Philip into kind of maintaining a relationship with Princess Elizabeth. She was completely smitten with him from the age of 13. And I think she wrote to him to say, you know, thank you for entertaining us at Dartmouth. And I suppose it gradually kept up. Then, of course, during the time when he was on leave, on shore leave, he often went to stay at Windsor Castle.
Her Royal Highness is the proud and happy mother of a prince. The salute is fired, and in the monarch's home lies the infant boy who will one day be king. On Saturday, the eminent gynecologist Sir William Gilliot was called to the palace for the most responsible case in even his career. By his advice, Sister H.M. Rowe was chosen midwife. The whole country knew that the baby would soon be born. All day on Sunday, people waited outside the palace, including phlegmatic pressmen with whom it is a point of honor to show no excitement. And all day there was no announcement. It was after 10 at night that those who waited, and they were very many, heard the tremendous news, a royal baby and a boy. Radio gave no advantage to watchers at the palace. The glad tidings went out everywhere.
This is the BBC Home Service. It has been announced officially from Buckingham Palace during the past hour that Her Royal Highness, the Princess Elizabeth, Duchess of Edinburgh, was safely delivered of a prince at 9:14 p.m. today, and that Her Royal Highness and her son are both doing well.
The press agencies were covering the world. The miracles of modern communication spanned the globe. Unto us a child is born. And no ordinary child, a prince. For the moment, all other news took second place. The morning newspapers went to press with one of those rare, warm stories that touch every heart. Cable and radio brought thousands of messages of congratulation from every corner of the Commonwealth. The young royal mother, herself a child but little more than yesterday, lay at her parents' home, an infant prince at her side. By custom, the Home Secretary was among the first informed. When he arrived at the Home Office next morning, the announcement hung outside. Mr. Chutereed was not called to the palace. No one feared in this day and age that some other child would be foisted on the nation. Privileged on this royal occasion to drive through Marble Arch into the park were a King's troop of Royal Horse Artillery. It was their honor and proud duty to fire the salute of 41 guns, announcing the birth of a prince.
Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles, on 14 November 1948. 1 month earlier, the king had issued letters patent allowing her children to use the style and title of a royal prince or princess, to which they otherwise would not have been entitled as their father was no longer a royal prince. A second child, Princess Anne, was born in 1950.
New joy has come to the royal family in the birth to Princess Elizabeth at Clarence House of a second son. But of course, the joy is not restricted to the royal family, and messages of congratulation from all over the world have been pouring into the princess's home ever since the news became known. The early years of marriage have set the seal on the happiness of the princess and her husband. The blessing of children has come not only to enrich their lives, but also to establish securely the line of succession. In Prince Charles, the public has acquired a new popular subject of interest, of whom some delightful pictures have been taken. We should like to see more of him, but the insatiable demand of the public has had to bow to the princess's very proper determination that her son shall not be spoilt by publicity. The public will be no less curious to see the first pictures of his brother, to compare the likenesses and note the differences. To Sir William Gilliatt, the great gynecologist, fell the medical responsibility of seeing the new prince safely into the world. The nurse was Miss Helen Rowe. Everything possible to ensure the safety and health of mother and son was naturally done, but there must always be anxiety. That is now over, and the nation's rejoicing is marked by a salute of guns. This is fired in Hyde Park by the Royal Horse Artillery in full dress.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and to the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. But I shall not have strength to carry out this resolution alone unless you join in it with me, as I now invite you to do. I know that your support will be unfailingly given. God help me to make good my vow, and God bless all of you who are willing to share in it.
Well, I think the reason that the Queen is referred to by some historians as the unlikely Queen is that, you know, she wasn't prepared to be Queen. She was married in 1947, and she expected to have a proper, long-ish married life before her father, you know, died. But he died quite suddenly. So she was an unlikely queen. And also she wasn't designated to be queen because her uncle, who became Edward VIII very briefly, abdicated and put Elizabeth directly in the line of succession.
During 1951, George VI's health declined, and Elizabeth frequently stood in for him at public events. When she toured Canada and visited President Harry S. Truman in Washington, D.C. in October 1951, her private secretary, Martin Charteris, carried a draft accession declaration in case the king died while she was on tour.
What happened was the Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were standing in for the King and Queen, and they started a big Commonwealth tour in Kenya, as it was called in those days. And the people of Kenya wanted them to be there, and they'd given them lodge for their wedding present. And the sort of joy for them was that they were going to visit this game reserve, and there was a little place called Treetops, which was overlooking a salt lake, so you could really see the animals. You know, this is 1952, so the whole of Kenya was teeming with game, and they spent the night up there. And actually, it was during the night, unbeknownst to the princess, that she became queen. So they left their game viewing, went back to Sagana Lodge, and had a little sleep because they'd been up all night. When the news came across to Prince Philip's private secretary, Mike Parker, that the king had died, and he thought that he eventually had one of those little radios, and he fiddled with it, and eventually he heard the sounds of Big Ben, and he knew that the news was true. And it was his duty to tell Prince Philip, which was probably, he says later, the most difficult thing he'd ever had to do in his life. So he went to Prince Philip and told him the news that his wife, Prince Philip's wife, was queen. So Prince Philip was in such shock, he just put a newspaper over his face and let the news just absorb. And then he got up and he went and got the princess out of her bedroom where she was resting and took her down to the lake at the bottom of the garden. And the lady in waiting tells a wonderful story. She watched them walk up and down, and she knew that he was telling her. And when they walked back into the lodge, she was putting her arms around the princess, and she thought, my goodness, but she's queen, and dropped into a curtsy. And then, of course, they had to make their way back to England as quickly as possible, but by the time they arrived back at London Airport, she came down the steps, beautifully dressed in her black clothes, and Prince Philip waited on the steps until she was at the bottom, and she greeted her Prime Minister. And that's how it was going to be from then on. Well, I think Prince Philip never envisaged that his young princess would become queen so quickly. They thought they had years ahead of them. So I think it was very difficult when suddenly his wife became queen. And, you know, he was demoted, if you like, to forever walk 2 steps behind. And he was treated very badly by the stuffy old courtiers at the palace. And, you know, they thought he was an interloper. You know, he was far too German. And although he was a Greek prince, you know, he had a lot of German blood, so they just called him, and they just thought he was German. And so it was very, very difficult for him. The Princess Elizabeth became queen in February 1952, and the coronation was in June 1953. But there was no plan for her coronation. There had been a plan for her uncle's coronation, Edward VIII, but that had been scuppered. So it takes a long time to pull all the ends together. So it was decided that they would wait until June the following year, and then everything could be lined up, because for a coronation you've got to have all the heads of state from all the various countries, all the Commonwealth. So you couldn't just say, well, we're going to have it in November. Everybody needed time to organize things. Well, the historical significance of the coronation is that it's a very ancient ceremony, and the Queen, as she was by then, but she has to be anointed in the eyes of God, and that is the coronation ceremony. So she sits on the throne in a very simple white linen dress, and she has holy oil put on her forehead, and that makes her queen in the eyes of God, which is why she always said in all her speeches, you know, I will rule and I will do my duty, and as long as I'm fit and able to do so. So it's an anointing ceremony in the eyes of God, and that was the great importance of it. And then, of course, you've got all the pomp and ceremony of all the lords and the ladies and the dignitaries and the heads of state. So it was an enormous undertaking, and it was televised because Prince Philip pushed the idea that it would be a great thing for the country and the Commonwealth and the world even to have this ancient ceremony televised. And it was, and it was taken back to America by plane. And I know the two big networks at the time, which was CBS and NBC, were in a sort of a race against each other to see who could get the film footage first. So there was all kinds of things like that. And although America got a little tiny snippet of the coronation, they didn't have the full ceremony, obviously. It had to be played out in cinemas in those days. Well, when the Queen came to the throne, she was only 26, and Churchill made the remark to his private secretary, but she's a child. But she wasn't a child. She was very sophisticated and mature mentally, and it was a man's world, and you know, women were really subservient in those days. And the Queen was walking into this world of men who were all much, much older than her. And also she hadn't really, you know, been taught. She said there was no way to be taught. All she did was she watched what her father did and followed him. So of course, the court was very old-fashioned and very stuffy, you know, because it was really her father's court. I think the day-to-day life of the monarch is very regimented. I mean, she would be woken, that's about 7:30. She would have, her dresser would come in with a cup of tea and some biscuits for the dogs. You know, her clothes would be laid out. She would dress, have breakfast, and then read the newspapers and listen to the radio, and then her day would start, and her private secretary would bring her important letters to look at and sign. And then every 20 minutes during the day, there is an appointment. So it's the same every day during the working week. So it is a very regimented life.
At this moment of my Silver Jubilee, I want to thank all those in Britain and the Commonwealth who, through their loyalty and friendship, have given me strength and encouragement during these last 25 years. My thanks go also to the many thousands who have sent me messages of congratulations on my Silver Jubilee, that and their good wishes for the future. My Lord Mayor, when I was 21, I pledged my life to the service of our people, and I asked for God's help to make good that vow. Although that vow was made in my salad days when I was green in judgment, I do not regret nor retract one word of it.
Since Elizabeth rarely gives interviews, little is known of her personal feelings. As a constitutional monarch, she has not expressed her own political opinions in a public forum. She does have a deep sense of religious and civic duty and takes her coronation oath seriously. Aside from her official religious role as Supreme Governor of the Established Church of England, she is a member of that church and also of the National Church of Scotland.
I think the characteristics that spring to mind to me are that she is stable, she's diligent, and she has an extraordinary ability to put duty before everything. And that is, a characteristic that really doesn't exist anymore. But the Queen was probably the last person, to decide that duty was everything. Duty became before personal happiness. Duty became before family and children. And that is the characteristic that defines her. And I think her stability also defines her, and the fact that she looks very somber, but then, her face can crack into the most wonderful smile, and we learn over the years about her sense of humor and her ability with mimicry. So we've got to know her, but very gradually. Well, 1992 was the worst year of the Queen's life. And she gave a speech at the Mansion House in London towards the end of 92. And she said she was going to refer to the year as an annus horribilis. And we all knew why, because it was, there was her daughter, Princess Anne, was separated, divorced, and remarried at the end of the year. Well, the remarriage was happy, but so her daughter's marriage had broken down. Fergie and Andrew's marriage had broken down, but far the worst thing was the breakdown of the marriage of the Prince and Princess of Wales, and the official announcement that they were going to split. And then on top of all that came the fire at Windsor Castle on the Queen's anniversary. A curtain caught upon a light in the chapel at Windsor Castle, and it just blazed, and the fire raced through all the state apartments. It was a huge fire. But lucky very, very few things were lost, but it was devastating. And then the Prime Minister asked the country if they would be prepared to pay for the reconstruction of Windsor Castle, and basically the Queen's subjects said no. I mean, although Windsor Castle is an official state building, not her own, the general consensus was that we didn't want to pay for it. So then the Queen had to pay tax. And it just really wasn't a good year.
"1992 is not a year on which I shall look back with undiluted pleasure. In the words of one of my more sympathetic correspondents, it has turned out to be an annus horribilis. In that old maxim, moderation in all things. I sometimes wonder how future generations will judge the events of this tumultuous year. I dare say that history will take a slightly more moderate view than that of some contemporary commentators. He who has never failed to reach perfection has a right to be the harshest critic. There can be no doubt, of course, that criticism is good for people and institutions that are part of public life. No institution, city, monarchy, whatever, should expect to be free from the scrutiny of those who give it their loyalty and support, not to mention those who don't. But we are all part of the same fabric of our national society, and that scrutiny by one part of another can be just as effective if it is made with a touch of gentleness, good humour, and understanding. This sort of questioning can also act, and it should do so, as an effective engine for change.
I think that the death of Princess Diana was the biggest crisis of the Queen's reign, and probably something that historically she will be judged by. And I think, despite the film The Queen, and despite The Crown, people still think the Queen handled it badly and didn't seem to understand what her subjects were feeling and thinking. But I think the Queen didn't understand, because traditionally, the royal family, when there is a death, and there've been many, many, they mourn quietly amongst themselves. And the Queen thought, because of William and Harry, it would be utter cruelty to expose them to crowds of wailing people, and that they must be kept at Balmoral. But it actually was wrong, as it turned out. But she remedied the situation, but I think it will still be seen as probably one of the disasters of her reign. So when the Queen and Philip arrived in London from Balmoral, there were crowds and crowds of people outside Buckingham Palace and flowers, and the Queen was actually very nervous because there was such an atmosphere. I mean, I was there. I remember the atmosphere was sort of, you almost felt that there was going to be a revolution. But she walked through the crowd, and it was sort of, for the moment, it was silent. And then a lady handed her some flowers, and she said, "Oh, shall I put them by the gate?" She said, "No, ma'am, they're for you." And that broke the tension. And after that, it was all right.
First, I want to pay tribute to Diana myself. She was an exceptional and gifted human being. In good times and bad, she never lost her capacity to smile and laugh, nor to inspire others with her warmth and kindness. I admired and respected her for her energy and commitment to others, and especially for her devotion to her two boys. This week at Balmoral, we have all been trying to help William and Harry come to terms with the devastating loss that they and the rest of us have suffered. No one who knew Diana will ever forget her. Millions of others who never met her, but felt they knew her, will remember her. I, for one, believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death.
2002 was an incredibly difficult year for Her Majesty. Her sister, Princess Margaret, died in the King Edward VII's Hospital, London, at 6:30 a.m. on February 9, 2002, at age 71. One day after having suffered a stroke that resulted in cardiac problems, and 3 days after the 50th anniversary of her father's death. On 30 March 2002 at 3:15 p.m., the Queen Mother died in her sleep at the Royal Lodge, Windsor Great Park, with Queen Elizabeth II at her bedside. She had been suffering from a cold for the previous 4 months. Despite an incredible difficult period of loss and mourning, Queen Elizabeth made a televised address to the nation in order to thank them for their support and well wishes during such a tough time.
Ever since my beloved mother died over a week ago, I have been deeply moved by the outpouring of affection which has accompanied her death. My family and I always knew what she meant for the people of this country, and the special place she occupied in the hearts of so many here, in the Commonwealth, and in other parts of the world. But the extent of the tribute that huge numbers of you have paid my mother in the last few days has been overwhelming. I have drawn great comfort from so many individual acts of kindness and respect. Over the years, I have met many people who have had to cope with family loss, sometimes in the most tragic of circumstances. So I count myself fortunate that my mother was blessed with a long and happy life. She had an infectious zest for living, and this remained with her until the very end. I know, too, that her faith was always a great strength to her. At the ceremony tomorrow, I hope that sadness will blend with a wider sense of thanksgiving, not just for her life, but for the times in which she lived. A century for this country and the Commonwealth, not without its trials and sorrows, but also one of extraordinary progress, full of examples of courage and service, as well as fun and laughter. This is what my mother would have understood, because it was the warmth and affection of people everywhere which inspired her resolve, dedication, and enthusiasm for life. I thank you for the support you are giving me and my family as we come to terms with her death and the void she has left in our midst. I thank you also from my heart for the love you gave her during her life and the honor you now give her in death. May God bless you all.
The Queen was very, very close to her mother and her sister. So for both of them to pass away within 2 months of each other was, a sort of double shock for her. Her sister was very unwell, and I think that didn't come as a surprise. And because of the Queen Mother's great age, that didn't come as a surprise either. But it was still a shock, and she was still, full of grief for the passing. But luckily, she was actually out riding when her mother started to slip away, and her staff managed to get a message to her, so she got back to her mother's bedside, so she was there. The whole country was so moved by the passing of the Queen Mother that the Queen actually gave a speech from Windsor thanking everyone for their concern, their good wishes, and their loyalty to her mother.
I'm naturally somewhat biased, but I think our children have done rather well under very different and difficult and demanding circumstances. I hope we can be forgiven for feeling rather proud of them. And I'm also encouraged to see what a good start the next generation is making. And I think that the main lesson that we've learned is that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It may not be quite so important when things are going well, but it is absolutely vital when things get difficult. And you can take it from me that the Queen has the quality of tolerance and abundance.
I think many people have asked the Queen and asked Prince Philip what is the secret of their relationship, and the Queen has spoken out on a few occasions, and she said patience, sense of humour, and she said famously, of course, that Prince Philip had simply been her rock and her stay over the years, and he'd always been there to support her. Although he never involved himself in constitutional affairs, he was there as a sounding board. He was someone to listen and someone who would be on her side or would give her criticism, which of course nobody else really could.
Our humble and hearty thanks to all those in Britain and around the world who have welcomed us and sustained us and our family in the good times and the bad so unstintingly over many years. This has given us strength, most recently during the sad days after the tragedy of Diana's death. It is you, if I may now speak to all of you directly, who have seen us through and helped us to make our duty fun. We are deeply grateful to you, each and every one. Yesterday, I listened as Prince Philip spoke at the Guildhall, and I then proposed our host's health. Today, the roles are reversed. All too often, I fear Prince Philip has had to listen to me speaking. Frequently, we have discussed my intended speech beforehand, and as you will imagine, his views have been expressed in a forthright manner. He is someone who doesn't take easily to compliments, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years. And I and his whole family, and this and many other countries, owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim or we shall ever know. Change has become a constant. Managing it has become an expanding discipline. The way we embrace it defines our future. I would like above all to declare my resolve to continue, with the support of my family, to serve the people of this great nation of ours to the best of my ability through the changing times ahead. Having on so many occasions been welcomed to opening ceremonies around the Commonwealth, it is a pleasure this time to welcome you to my own home. Here at Buckingham Palace in 1949, my father met the heads of government when they ratified the London Declaration, which created the Commonwealth as we know it today, then comprising just 8 nations. Who then, or in 1952, when I became head of the Commonwealth, would have guessed that a gathering of its member states would one day number 53, or that it would comprise 2.4 billion people? I remember my own lifelong commitment made in South Africa in 1947 at the age of 21. As another birthday approaches this week, I am reminded of the extraordinary journey we have been on and how much good has been achieved. It remains a great pleasure and honor to serve you as head of the Commonwealth and to observe with pride and satisfaction that this is a flourishing network. It is my sincere wish that the Commonwealth will continue to offer stability and continuity for future generations, and will decide that one day the Prince of Wales should carry on the important work started by my father in 1949. By continuing to treasure and reinvigorate our associations and activities, I believe we will secure a safer, more prosperous and sustainable world for those who follow us. A world where the Commonwealth's generosity of spirit can bring its gentle touch of healing and hope to all.